Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hate to break up the conversations and everything. It's great to see everybody face to face again and networking once again. And it's so nice to be back in person. And again, thanks everybody for attending and making the effort. And it's just really exciting. You can just feel the energy. We did the innovation workshop yesterday, and it was just fun. To be back in person, and so this is continuing. It's been a great morning, and there's a lot going on the rest of the week. I'm Paul Iaizzo. I'm a professor in Department of Surgery. Helped organize this conference for the last 21 years with Professor Art Erdman and Will Durfee, and it's an extreme privilege and honor that I've been able to do this. And one of the things I've also been able to do is introduce the award winners, conference award winners, which I'll do shortly. But there's a lot of fun stuff that you need to think about. We have the 5-minute pitch competitions tomorrow morning. Really looking forward to those. This is a highlight every year. And again, that's tomorrow morning in the ballrooms. And, you know, come in and support everybody, 8 o'clock. There's all the sponsors tables. And again, this is what's really exciting. All these sponsors are back in person. And take the time, introduce yourselves, meet these people. They made the effort to come here. They're supporting the conference. They're supporting our ability to get together and learn all about medical devices. There's tours that you can go to, selected tours. The student showcase winners, it's happening tonight at 5:30 in the Pinnacle Ballroom. So, you know, a lot going on, and I'll remind you of that. But I went to the sessions this morning. The keynote by Professor Toner was amazing, and then the sessions are great. So continue to participate and enjoy this. But like I said, now I get the honor and privilege to introduce the conference annual award winner. You can see it there, our keynote presenter, and that's Dr. Cooper, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Medical Solutions and Global Director of Safety at 3M Healthcare. I'll give these awards to people that are really foster the mission of the university, champion the university, collaborate with the university, and so Matt is on our industrial advisory board for the Institute for Injury Medicine. He's been an industrial conference organizer. He's sponsored the new product design and business development classes. He's just been a mentor to us relative to educating the next generation of medical device developers. And so he's, you know, a really good friend of the U. He's got an amazing background, and I got to read some of these highlights because, you know, that's where he serves now, but he's a certified diplomat of the American Board of Thoracic Surgery, and so he's a cardiac surgeon, done a lot of congenital work. He's also Associate Fellow of Aerospace Medicine Association, and so he did numerous training after medical school, residencies, fellowships across the U.S. Then he went on to the NIH and did additional training there. And so, amazing career. He did a lot of work on immunosuppression in primates, cardiac xenotransplantation. At 3M, he has a number of different roles. But to me, what's intriguing about his resume, and I'm sure he'll get into that when he maybe talks about Pursuit, that he's a senior aviation medical examiner. He's an expert in aviation physiology and a special consultant to the Federal Air Surgeon. He's a commercial pilot, flight instructor, aerobatic and formation air show performer, And he's flown a variety of single, multi-engine, general, and military aircrafts. And so in all that, he's been a leader in the application aviation-based safety culture and brought this to healthcare. And so it's this kind of novel training and his background as a surgeon, and now what he's bringing to the ecosystem of medical devices in Minnesota is highly appreciated. So Matt, we really look forward to what you have to say this afternoon, and congratulations.
Thank you, Dr. Iaizzo. Well, based on that introduction, hopefully I'm not done yet. In fact, in some ways, I feel like I'm just starting. And I very much want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share a few thoughts. With respect to disclosure, I'm an employee of 3M, and as was mentioned, a special consultant to the Federal Air Surgeon. We often stand on the shoulders of others, and certainly learn from those who have come before. Baron Dominique Jean Leray, Napoleon's Surgeon General, is often considered the father of what's called expeditionary medicine. He was challenged by caring for soldiers injured at the front lines. He observed ammunition supply wagons returning empty from the front and is noted to have said, "That is stupid. We must do better." Thus were born ambulance volante, so-called flying ambulances, and he developed a plan of rapid evacuation of the wounded using these flexible medical units. He thought outside the box. He saw a status quo that he could do better. In precisely the same tone, Major General Paul Friedrichs, Dr. Friedrichs, the military's highest-ranking physician, reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs, in a recent address entitled "The Urgency of Action," observed, "Where is stupid today? We accept because of what we are used to. We must be inspired because we can do better to confront egregious stupidity. Good enough is not. Never settle. Pursue better." The military worries about the interface of scaled delivery of care in a cyber-degraded, contested environment where there must be a seamless handoff between logistics and medical enterprises. This is what challenged Leray. Is this not what has challenged us as well? That cyber-degraded fog of war could be applied to a busy emergency department, the operating room for a complex operation, or the prevention and management of a global pandemic. Who will be the Leray of our times? Don't look to others. A consistent thread in what you will hear from me today is that the most remarkable solutions are found in diverse discourse. Don't allow the hubris of thinking that only we can solve our own problems. The most valuable thing that each of us bring to bear is the 6 inches between our ears, a commitment to think and an unrelenting commitment to not accept good enough, rather to pursue better. The pandemic, we were unprepared. We had depleted stockpiles, chronically down-staffed critical care units with higher than optimal patient-to-nurse ratios that were caught woefully inadequate when utilization soared. We lacked rapidly recruitable slack or warm manufacturing and other capacity. We lacked the level of preparedness required, the connection between logistics and medicine. Unfortunately, over time, as humanity, we have been forced to learn from such circumstance. When we have been stripped to the crucible of survival, we learn to work even more efficiently and effectively in a changed, resource-challenged state, while still preserving and practicing the necessary carryover of best practices, just like the battlefield. We have much to learn. Why did we find ourselves in this situation? How do we learn from this? First, we lost situational awareness, or SA. Situational awareness is the full and predictive awareness of all around us. It is both an individual and a shared construct that optimizes decision-making. That's why it's important. SA, situational awareness, in its highest form, provides an ability to predict a future state. We must then be able to supply the prioritized will to act on what is foretold. It is not enough just to optimize now. We must substantively pave and prepare also for the future. Situational awareness is the foundation of effective decision-making, and effective decision-making is at the heart of effective action in all human pursuits. SA is a continuous and dynamic process. It's both individual and it's group. So, for example, is there shared situational awareness going on here? If the answer is yes, then maybe look a bit closer. We talk of optimized decision-making. Are you necessarily born with such skills, or can they truly be learned? In fact, decision-making, like many other things, is an acquired skill that can be developed and taught and trained and practiced. So far, an interim summary of what I've told you tells us that accepting what is because it is easy should never win over what is better or right. Don't walk by. Don't accept that change is for others to do. Further, we accept that optimizing the present should not be done at the expense of the future. The process of analyzing and potentially resynthesizing to better understand and manage our environment is based on our own accurate perception and foresight. This recurrent pattern or loop is subject to practice and improvement, and it's worth noting that we perform down to our level of training. Training is important. To be or to do. It's not about rank or earning a patch in the military or an expected reward. As per Luray and General Friedrichs, and what we see during this pandemic, if you see an opportunity, don't wait for the next person to solve it. Take it on. Remember, we bring to bear what is between our ears, the ability to look at the resources available, to look at a problem, to come up with a better solution. Why was Colonel Boyd referred to as 42nd Boyd? During his career, starting from a position of disadvantage, he could defeat any opposing pilot in air combat maneuvering in less than 40 seconds. Many of you have heard of Boyd, and perhaps even of his so-called OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, a decision cycle. Certainly you may readily grasp that it is in relationship to situational awareness, as we've already touched upon. You may even be further familiar with Boyd's theory of energy and maneuverability and its role in the foundation of Agile Scrum. Jeff Sutherland, one of the creators of Scrum, is in fact a West Point-trained fighter pilot. Who was John Boyd? Now, I said who was John Boyd, not who is John Galt, just for reference. He was a fighter pilot with no aerial victories in combat, yet he is acknowledged as one of the greatest fighter pilots in history. His contributions to the theory of aerial warfare are the anchor for training for every fighter pilot in the world today, and his theories to evaluate every fighter aircraft design. He is the father of the F-15, the F-16, and the F-18. Why is he important to us, you might ask? He's had no published works. He taught only through briefings. But he saw the individual as the center of a decision loop that can be extended to teams and to culture. He saw this as a heuristic, a guide for independent and effective action to cope with our environment. Something absolutely critical to all who work together, as we do, under conditions of stress and uncertainty. Boyd's synthesis derived from science and math, from the second law of thermodynamics to Gödel, from theories of history and conflict to Eastern philosophy. He interpreted, he modernized, and he applied. What do we learn and take away from Boyd? Not just that big engines and big wings are good. There's a bunch of math here, and I will distill this down for you a bit, although with all the engineers in the room, you'd probably do fine on your own. There are many aspects that you will recognize and be familiar with, and this will not be a treatise on war, though Boyd himself started with Sun Tzu. What will be consistent is the critical and foundational technology we bring to bear, as I've talked about, that between our ears. Maneuverability, the radius of a turn, the rate of a turn, the g-forces, multiples of gravity encountered. Think for a moment about these considerations. Limits, boundaries in all we do. How much operating space and resources do we have? How fast can we move and pivot? It gets to our system and our capability. Logistics. How much pressure can we tolerate to achieve the change we desire? Where did Boyd get the idea? He saw fundamental commonalities in dynamic situations. Combat between the US F-86 and the MiG-15, the Entebbe raid by Israel, and the difference between maneuvers of Blitzkrieg and the Maginot Line. What were the commonalities? Better visibility, situational awareness, the ability to transition from one maneuver to another with less effort, advantage gained by so-called fast transients. The idea is that the key to success is to observe, orient, decide, and execute at a tempo that outpaces the ability of your adversary, whether that's commercial, whether that's a disease state, whether it's a virus replicating. To operate inside your opponent's decision cycle, to simultaneously compress your own time while stretching out that of your adversary, to generate a favorable mismatch, is the ability in time to shape and adapt to change, and a decided advantage. He who can handle the quickest rate of change survives. The ability to execute so-called fast transients, to respond to changes quickly and routinely, provides a decisive edge. How did we do during the initial stages of the pandemic? Look at how slowly we were able to figure out and disseminate treatment of the so-called happy hypoxemics, and how to figure out and share that prone positioning was effective, though counter to many of our standard practices. How did we do in our timing with respect to testing and vaccination? Were we able to act within the cycles of development of herd immunity and virus mutation? In our modern world, perhaps, it isn't so much what we know that gives us an edge, but perhaps rather how fast we can figure out the meaning of what is new and respond. Thus back to Boyd. This will lead us shortly to a valuable use of distributed decision-making, and again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Next, we need to build organizations that can execute. Change is hard. There's misunderstanding, there are disagreements, there are challenges to leadership. Clausewitz talked about friction, such as uncertainty, psychological and moral forces that impede activity. Friction diminishes understanding. It diminishes trust, cooperation, and focus. Non-cooperative centers of gravity, organizational silos, magnify friction, and they restrict our ability as human beings to adapt to systems and to our surroundings. The result? Confusion, disorder, and further impediment to vigorous, direct action. Boyd added, of course, at the end, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. The solution? Pump up the creativity and initiative of everybody in the organization and harmonize them to achieve purposes of the organization. This is very well described, and I recommend to you Liz Weissman's work on multipliers. Trust is required for cohesion, for harmony of focus and effort. Courage, confidence, and spirit are counterweights to fear, anxiety, and alienation. Adaptability counters uncertainty. How do we evolve to a system of insight, initiative, adaptability, harmony? This is Boyd's organizational climate and its constituent components. Fingertip feeling, a oneness or unity, a shared focus, a contract for intent, and agility. Such an organization is in fact modeled after Miyamoto Musashi in nurturing the ability to perceive the truth in all matters and perceiving, importantly, that which cannot be seen with the eye. Boyd's system, fingertip feeling, an appreciation of who we are as an organization and of who we are, and that we wield that with both nuance and dexterity. The sense of oneness, a sense of unity, is in fact an old concept, the way, dating back to Sun Tzu. How are we doing working together to accomplish our mission? Also a shared sense of situational awareness, of present, but importantly, future state. A shared focus, a coherent path forward. Then the idea of a contract of intent may be more familiar to you as we think of it today, referred to as commander's intent. A clear and common outlook from leaders that gives team members the freedom of ongoing action to accomplish. A too flagrant current example of why this is important. Look at the centralized, rigid system of the Russian forces attacking the Ukraine. They lack commander's intent. They ignore and stifle the human adaptability to deal with uncertainty, change, and stress. Large armies and massed firepower and other vast needs that are supported through narrow fixed logistic networks fail. They failed in Desert Storm, and they're failing for the Russians now. Stereotyped actions suppress ambiguity, they suppress deception, and they suppress the mobility and surprise of any operation. For all of our endeavors to be effective, what we learn is that flexibility and critical thinking are vital in challenging pursuits. Lower level teams, as in Agile Scrum, are able to shape and direct their own activities so that they can exploit a faster tempo and a faster tactical rhythm than the bigger organization, yet they are still in harmony with the larger pattern and the slower rhythm and the general aim of the bigger organization. That's commander's intent. A final example of commander's intent is shown here: to take initiative as the situation demands. Boyd's final attribute is agility, but for Boyd, this is a little bit different than the usual meaning. Be humble and be willing to change and not afraid to let go of the present if there is a better opportunity from the future. We need to foresee that current methods soon won't work, even though they may have been working up to now. And again, a recurrent theme. We can't just look at our own experiences or use the same mental recipes again and again. We have to go outside of our system, outside of our own system, another ancient concept, to learn from other disciplines and activities what may be applicable. If we are able to do this, if we are able to surface new repertoires, we need to wield those with that same nuance, dexterity, that same fingertip feel. From his analysis, finally, we get back to the OODA loop. Boyd developed a loop, a model of situational awareness, analysis, and response known as the OODA loop. However, it's not as simple as observe, orient, decide, and act. In fact, it doesn't work sequentially at all. Orientation is, in fact, where we start. Orientation is the repository of all we are: genetic heritage, cultural tradition, previous experiences. It is the most important part of the OODA loop. It shapes the way we interact with the environment. It shapes the way we observe, the way we decide, the way we act. Orient, interpreting what was observed, forming a picture of the situation, involves hypothesis testing, checking what is actually happening against what should be if our conclusions are correct. Orientation, however, controls all. It also, however, carries all of the biases and assumptions that are inherent in our human nature. As such, there is a heavy bias in seeing what is believed versus seeing what is. Observe the process of physically sensing the outside world, deciding based on situational awareness the next action to take to gain advantage. To act, to carry out the action, presumes our will and ability to do so. Orientation shapes the character of the present OODA loop, and these present loops shape the character of future orientation. Competitive advantage comes from quickness over the entire loop, not from one aspect or the other. When you are doing OODA loops correctly, accuracy and speed improve together. They don't trade off. A primary function of management is to build an organization that gets better and better at these things. Given that your orientation, which is dynamic, is well matched to reality, you must have actions available to influence the situation, and these actions must flow smoothly and rapidly from orientation. Otherwise, you hesitate, perhaps in endless rounds of meetings and conferences during which you lose your potential advantage. There is no case where slower is better, and obviously, this requires, as we've mentioned, training and practice. Putting this all together, our success becomes increasingly dependent on our ability to see, to analyze, synthesize, and understand, to act, and to repeat to advantage. Remember, I told you that orientation as the center of the loop is full of all of our human biases and heuristics. In fact, as human beings, we have a long list of cognitive biases by which we evaluate our surrounding environment. Add to that further compounding factors that are familiar, such as fatigue, long working hours, fitness, medications, our environment, and of course, stress. Because of that, humans are prone to what's called target fixation. And as you can see and might be suggested from this picture, target fixation can have suboptimal outcomes at times. It has been said that we as leaders have a responsibility to put into place systems to support safe practices. James Conway from IHI has said that our systems are in fact too complex to expect merely extraordinary people to perform perfectly 100% of the time. Merely extraordinary team members. It brings us to one of our next challenges: augmented cognition. We face increasingly complex environments. There's an increased cognitive load in much of what we do. And that load increases when we must sort out new information. As human beings, we're very good at visual recognition. We're not at all very good about incorporating new information. Probably most of you have seen the videos of the gorilla in our midst in attentional blindness as a perfect example. Augmented cognition has many goals. And as I mentioned, while we're good at visual recognition, we're limited in our ability to incorporate new information and change the direction of our decision vectors. We need to move beyond what we use as human beings intuitively. That is something called recognition prime decision making. That is, we make decisions based on what we've seen before that's either the same or similar and applicable. There is the potential to move beyond that so that while we may still make decisions, as we do in healthcare all of the time, with imperfect or incomplete information, we do strive to get the right information to the right people at the right time to do the best we can. And again, precision and speed required in those processes. How do we determine from the standpoint of technology when information is needed? Well, DARPA has worked for years on psychophysiologic indicators that may indicate when there's stress, when there is cognitive overload. If we figure out when information is needed, how do we figure out what that information is? And then how do we figure out how is it best to communicate it and how to deliver it and at what rate? These are the challenges that stand before us in trying to augment that 6 inches between our ears that we bring as the fundamental foundation of all of our pursuits. Many of you are familiar with the telos suit, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But for all of these sorts of inventions and nuances, the main goal is the development of a technology to augment situational awareness, where we started today. Augmented reality exists in an ideal situation to assist us in handling cognitive load. And I'll show you examples of both of these. There has been staged development at DARPA, and it's interesting to look and see that with all of the work that's been shown at the conference, for example, about machine learning. This is a concept of technology that derived in the 1970s. We're still maturing that, and we've got a long way to go. There's much more and better to come, DARPA's third wave, so to speak. So this is the Talos suit, the Iron Man suit, so to speak. And again, the main motivator of this suit, this capability, is to augment situational awareness so that decision-making is improved, effective action, precise action is enhanced. In fact, this program was terminated about 2 years ago, although the technology needs and the technology developments are now still present in different form factors, but not the suit per se. So how does augmented reality work? Well, if you're an individual user, you can look out on a scene. There we go. And this is what you might see, what the camera sees, but with an AI overlay of software, analytics, and visualization. You have, in fact, that which the eye may not see by itself. Old concept, but having a fuller perception of your environment allows you to make better decisions, to respond better, quicker, and to see future states. So an interesting recent development is that of Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Pinedo at the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School. They have developed a machine learning system that interacts with the pilot of the prospective landing of a lunar module. And what this does is help the pilot make better decisions if he or she is low on fuel and the first couple of planned landing sites are no longer adequate. That may sound familiar to you. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, in fact, he was low on fuel. His first 3 landing sites were inadequate or dangerous. So would this new machine learning system have worked for Neil Armstrong? It raises the question of when is it appropriate for the human to override technology? If the data from these systems is digital, does it ultimately need to be converted back to analog to optimally integrate with our analog brains? And in fact, there are studies going on to transform data from the digital back to the analog so that they can be more readily included in our decision making. Allow me to return to Earth a little bit, for the moment anyway, to a more earthly consideration. The stethoscope was invented in 1816 by a French physician named René Laennec. He was treating a female patient and was embarrassed to use the traditional method of immediate auscultation, as it was referred to, which involved the doctor pressing his ear to the patient's chest. Laennec recounted that the method was rendered inadmissible by the age and sex of the patient. Instead, he rolled up a sheet of paper into a tube, which allowed him to hear his patient's heartbeat. He didn't settle. He created better. This is Lennox's original invention. This has persisted to our day in basic concept. Subsequently, and most recently, there has been emphasis on improved acoustic detection and definition. We have both mechanical and electronic digital capability with amplified sound and noise canceling. There is concern that as we evolve as human practitioners, that there is a lost skill in interpreting the meaning and the significance of sounds. As such, built-in analytic enhancements and relevant clinical decision support are of much interest these days. David Littman at Harvard Medical School in the 60s is credited with advancing acoustic designs. 3M Littman has since continued pioneering technologic development, and these are some representatives of our current Littman portfolio now. Things change, though, however, and as we look to the future, we can expect more change. For example, this is a new way to commute to work, for example, something that might be interesting to some of you. First there was Lennox, then there was the binaural, the earpieces of the stethoscope, and now there is the prospect of binaural-free auscultation. Other modern form factors have variable flexibility and varying capability. This is one of our current commercialized Littman 3M solutions. We have amplification of sound, we have active noise cancellation, we can tell you whether you have a murmur from the heart or not. We can tell you that if the murmur is, if present, whether it's innocent or structural in import, and we can tell you whether the murmur is systolic or diastolic in the timing of the cardiac cycle. There are, in fact, now deep learning algorithms that potentially outperform the human experts, cardiologists, in sensitivity and specificity of acoustic interpretation. Well, it's more difficult to get data to allow the algorithm to tell you what valve of origin is responsible for the sound, but it's on the near horizon. Can we tell you from sound the degree of valve stenosis? Perhaps another future consideration. Echo, our partner strategically, has a second device that offers an additional complementary capability. It has an algorithmic capability based on a single lead EKG that allows you to tell whether the current left ventricular ejection fraction is low, and also to predict whether it will be low 3 months from now. This has implications for early identification and intervention for heart failure, and has potentially life-saving potential. Now again, thanks to Dr. Iaizzo and his lab for this image, but it is true that hearts don't live by themselves. And so when we think about the use of sound to interpret the language of body systems, well, the heart sits next to the lungs. Is that where we're going next? And in fact, there is extensive work going on to interpret lung sounds to tell you whether you have consolidation, pneumonia, whether there's collapse of the lung, pneumothorax. Could that be effective in diagnosis of COVID? All of those things are true, and all of those things are the subject of current work. Evolution continues. This sort of development will disrupt care as we know it. It is new. We have to be open to that change. And what we stand to gain from this augmented human performance is accelerated decision-making. Accelerated therapy, that's the action based on that decision-making. Decreased testing, fewer visits, improved efficiency, improved outcomes, decreased total care, and definitely increased satisfaction for all involved, starting with the patients and not the least of which the practitioners. Well, the potential to obviate unnecessary echocardiograms, unnecessary chest x-rays, that future is here. There's flexibility whether you use binaurals or disconnected headsets or wireless earbuds or Bluetooth. All of those things are now possible. I'll give you a perfectly consistent example of how it's used today. Well, you probably know that we listen to astronauts' heartbeats. Well, we can do that wirelessly. That's an old concept, but it's now a concept that's been brought back to the earth and generalized in capabilities that we can offer to virtually all patients. Well, what do form factors look like in the future for some of this assistive capability in sensing and diagnosing? It may look like the Apple Watch, or it may look like something like this, a patch that works in an acute setting, in an out-of-hospital setting, or in an extreme environment deep underwater or in space. Implantables already exist for specific uses, and those are certainly the potential future as well. There is much work going on and much current focus on the development of point-of-care handheld diagnostic tools. Are there developments in these tools that will obviate acoustics? That may be the case. If they don't, will the ears of the operators still be needed, or are those to be taken out of the loop? What physiologic indicators will be detected and assessed? Well, point-of-care handheld ultrasound is here. The ability to collect images. Is it true that a picture is worth 1,000 words? Is it true that a picture is worth 1,000 sounds? It's yet to be fully realized, but certainly that capability, that future, is here. When we think about co-locating presentation, the ECG, the value of which I've told you about, sound, murmurs, the prognostic, diagnostic significance of those sounds, and an image all together in one place on a smartphone or on a smart tablet. That future is potentially here. Well, wait a second. Didn't we think about this years ago? We began thinking about acoustics. We added AI to acoustics. We added the EKG to the AI with clinical prognostication. We added point-of-care imaging with AI. Isn't that a tricorder? Isn't that an old concept that perhaps is really here? And in fact, there are real-life tricorders for this generation, our generation, to look at all body systems and interpret the language of those body systems non-invasively. That could be done anywhere, in any sort of setting, from urban to extreme, to offer real-time AI in the form of diagnostic support, support in terms of analytic syntheses, in terms of clinical decision support, augmenting our ability, our human senses, to better evaluate the functional state of organ systems. All of that is the future, and that is within reach. So, for example, we can do better than the status quo, as we've been talking about all morning. The status quo is on the left side. We get much from complaint history review systems. We get additional data from physical examination, and then we get hypothesis and diagnostic testing. But what I've shown you here this morning already changes that to a better future, where we add analytics to our initial information gathering. We add augmented sensing and point-of-care diagnostic testing to what we're able to do. Then potentially we're able to match the individual patient sitting in front of us with a virtual cohort that is propensity matched with the last 600 patients who are identical, to figure out what they might have in terms of their differential diagnosis and how best to treat them most effectively in a precise manner. One of the amazing potentials of AI is truly to democratize healthcare, to provide the equivalent of the best doctor, the best tests, and the best analyses anywhere that they're needed through sensing, Bluetooth communication, AI and diagnostic and clinical decision support. Again, that capability is within reach. Some examples of perhaps early tricorder systems, and I don't have an official affiliation with any of these, but MedWand is one. Tidal care is another. There are some caveats and cautions, however, that as we talk about the application and the implementation of AI in the care of patients, we need to make sure that it's consistent, it's trustworthy, it's reliable, and it works. And so there are lessons to have been learned from some of our previous pursuits that we need to consider before we say that the panacea has arrived, that humans are no longer needed in the decision loop. For example, a potential ecosystem of the future will variously include sensors, apps, cloud services, handheld devices, wearables, and maybe even implantables. And it's likely that all of these will be interoperable in some fashion. In beginning to sum up for you this afternoon, let me tell you that we are no longer limiting our sights to the moon, nor are we limiting explorers to train crews, as that picture of SpaceX on the right would show you. And in fact, there are already centers of shared translational science, such as Trish at the Baylor College of Medicine. But it's not just purely scientific either. There is already the creation of space-based ecosystems and the beginning development of what may be a limitless economy already valued at $1.7 trillion. It reminds us to remember why we are all here, particularly at this conference, particularly based on the spirit of this conference. And to read this precisely, we're here to put a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why else even be here? Innovation continues. Will you, as inventors and innovators, have as much faith in your creation as did the inventor of the bulletproof vest in the 1920s, that he was willing to have it tested on himself, as shown here? Interestingly, it took the military over 40 years to embrace bulletproof vests. And so as inventors and innovators, we have to have the confidence in our own work, the persistence to stand up for what we believe in when we find opportunities. And we have to be able to define that value for our leaders to make it so. Well, today, Captain James Tiberius Kirk has indeed now been to space. The biggest challenge to change may not be technical so much as cultural, to solve an adoption of the new technologies that come online. The only reason we shouldn't change is because we choose not to change. But otherwise, we should be looking to embrace the opportunities that the future offers. We cannot dwell only in perfection of the present at the expense of the future. Because if we are indeed to reach generational achievement as we have before, we need to bring all of our 6 inches between our ears and the technological augmentation together to enhance situational awareness, to make the best decisions we can, to take effective action. I would share with you a comment and a quote from a young philosopher named Bo Burnham that was introduced to me by my daughter Neela. Bo Burnham says that apathy is a tragedy and boredom is a crime. We cannot afford to be either, as we are in a critical stage of this republic and this earth and this humanity. We don't get to the future by being passive. And in fact, there is no growth in the comfort zone. And what we are doing today is not necessarily good enough for the future. And again, let me say thank you in 2 ways: for joining a commitment to never be complacent in accepting what is good or what is good enough in the status quo. And again, thank you for this tremendous opportunity and incredible honor.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cooper, for sharing your wisdom, the wisdom of others, and encouraging us all to apply it to our own lives. Very inspiring words. We're happy, I think he's happy to answer some questions. Do I have any questions in the audience? Come on, someone's here who's got some inspiration now to ask a question. Oh, there's Will's gonna jumpstart us. Here we
Thanks,
are.
Matt. That was an absolutely remarkable talk. In the second part, when you were talking about the increasingly sophisticated machines that are able to interpret signals and provide guidance, I'm wondering if you could present your vision of what that means for patient-directed healthcare, or even that word patient. So we become a patient when we see the experts like you in your clinical routine. With machines like this, can we start bringing that control back more to the patients, and what's that patient-clinician relation going to look like in the future?
So not exactly an easy question, Will. So I think I'd take a step back to answer that and say that in many things, we're challenged with accelerating learning so that those who are trying to get up to speed with current state can do that in a shorter period of time, so that they have more time to invent and innovate in the future. And I think that it's fine to educate patients, to involve them in the decisions that impact their very lives and souls. But the problem is that there is a context for that information that has to be shared as well. And so there may never be an equal balance between the contextual expertise of the patient in trying to evaluate information and signals as compared with the provider. And that's why it has to still be a partnership, but certainly maybe not equally participatory, but certainly a partnership that involves both in the interpretation and moving forward. Now, hopefully I answered you. There've got to be some easier questions out there. Yes?
Thank you so much. A great, inspiring presentation. I have a very generic question. Probably it could be easy or very difficult, right? You talk quite a bit about a culture change, imparting a change in thought process to have innovation, to think ahead of time through the presentation in various aspects. How do we make or enable this culture change at scale, right? So doing it in a team of 5, 6 is different versus really at scale when you look at bigger organizations.
Well, I think hopefully what I showed you today is that it cannot be a top-down, exquisitely constrained, directed process. It has to be a shared, coherent vision of where we're going, but that allows flexibility, adaptability, creativity, implicit application of smaller self-directed teams, very much the agile scrum that allows human creativity and endeavor to proceed, but again, aligned with the bigger picture. There has to be seamless sharing. There has to be a sharing across silos. There has to be a sharing of, as we started today, talking about logistics and scaled application. All of those same principles keep reappearing in different sorts of things in parallel because they're human things. And it's not going to happen overnight, obviously.
Can you tell me about a experience you had when you were flying, where you may have had a learning experience of some kind that maybe wasn't taught in flight school, and what your takeaway is on that?
Sure. I usually fly a 2-seat aerobatic airplane where the pilot flies from the back seat. And often when you take somebody for a ride in the front seat, they get nervous or scared and they reach for anything close by. And in most of those aerobatic planes, there's a big red handle over here that if the front seat passenger reaches for that in flight, It gets noisy and expensive at the same time because that's the canopy ejection. And so some friends and I had created this little half-circle piece of plastic that we used to wedge in there to prevent the front seat passenger from inadvertently jettisoning the canopy when they got afraid. So I had an air show to do one weekend, and I had a cousin who came to town who's a relatively big fellow, wanted a ride. So I took him for a ride. We came back to the airport. When he got out of the plane, I could not find that half-circle piece of plastic. Well, there's a name for that. That's called foreign object debris. I spent a couple of hours looking for that in the airplane, couldn't find it, and had an air show to do at a distant site the next morning. So the next morning, I flew the plane to that site. I did some maneuvers en route to try to find it, couldn't find it. And here's where I made my first huge mistake. Fortunately, I'm here to talk about it. So I flew the air show, and in the air show, I came out of a gyroscopic maneuver called a tumble. I was going end over end. I was 45 degrees, nose down, 500 feet elevation. My wife was in the audience. She saw me go below the horizon, and I could not get the stick back to get the nose up. And you have to revert to training, so-called hanger flying. So when people say that time slows down, it does indeed. I remember calling the air boss and saying, I have a problem, and him responding saying, just do what you need to do, we'll clear the airspace. Remember studying about the use of trim adjustments to deal with a stuck elevator. And in fact, I used trim to get the nose up, power for altitude, had a relatively firm landing, and then found that piece of plastic stuck in my elevator. So the takeaways from that is there was no reason I had to fly that morning. There were other performers, there were other people. I jeopardized myself, my family, and lots of other things for no good reason. You know, they teach scuba divers to plan the dive, dive the plan. It's the same thing with pilots. And so you have to evaluate your own fitness, you have to evaluate the situation and make your best decision. So I learned a lot from that.
Thank you so much for the innovative and insightful presentation. As a chief medical officer, I'd love to hear you extrapolate your vision for the future. I think one of our greatest shared challenges is improving equity in outcomes so that the people that are born in a location that's extra challenged, education, wealth, infrastructure, it feels like there are a lot of potentials to democratize that and improve their outcomes with this future technology. Where do you think we have the best opportunities?
Unfortunately, I don't think we can do it ourselves as commercial enterprises. We have to have partners. And so I think we are going to have to partner with governments and help set shared priorities. For example, in some of the underserved countries, locales in the world, or some of the underserved areas in the United States, you know, in indigenous populations. Priorities may not be right. So for example, in some parts of the world, having nuclear armamentarium may not be more important than delivering health care to those in need. But I think together, if we set our priorities, then the partnership with government, with industry, and military has a lot to offer in terms of logistics, experience and support. I think that's a start to do that. These are very challenging times. There's a significant economic challenge for companies to do that by themselves. And obviously we'll come out of that economic challenge in some respect, but I think there's still a partnership that solves it. One party is not going to do it by themselves. Yes?
My question has to do with forming teams. How do you,
with what? I'm sorry.
forming teams that are effective, right? If you were in a position to be able to form a team for the first time that is going to be on track and in pursuit, how would you pick the people? What are the key personality types you look for so that they all fit together and are effective?
Well, interestingly, you don't always get to pick all the people on your team, right? And so sometimes you have to optimize that. So I'll answer you indirectly if I have a moment to do that. So I had a friend who was involved in astronaut selection for many years. And what might not surprise you, that one of the things that they looked for in astronaut candidates was the ability for somebody to put their nose down and keep going under adversity. But that wasn't the key trait, and that wasn't all of it. What they looked for in the individuals actually selected beyond that were those who could do that, but knew when to pull the plug, knew when to change stride, change direction because of futility. So I look for that in the team. I look for a willingness to learn, an energy, a willingness to prepare. There is a maturity in developing teams. You know, we talk about the fact that we can't be complacent. Well, one of the ways that we don't allow high-performing teams to be complacent is we do something called a debrief. After a critical event, procedure, process, we evaluate what went well, positive reinforcement, and then we talk about what didn't in a constructive way so that the next go is better. If you don't take the time to develop the maturity first of the team, you'll never get to the constructive part. And so it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight.
Matt, you talked about the emerging technologies, AI, AR, and machine learning, things like that. In my perspective, those are pretty rapid rate. Can you give a perspective, at least from the corporate viewpoint, of how likely and how prepared the regulatory agencies are for dealing with that? Are they properly trained and motivated?
Well,
if you can.
In deference to some of my more experienced colleagues, specifically sitting behind you, I will be careful how I answer that. But I would say that, again, it's a partnership. There are organizations, for example, like MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, in which, because it's a non-lobbying organization, FDA sits with investigators and scientists and healthcare folks to talk about the nature of evidence required for adoption. And in fact, the ability to accelerate that may be in accepting more risk up front that is balanced by more rigorous, robust, mandatory post-market surveillance. I think it's a balance. I think we have a very sensitive society right now. And there has to be some tolerance and risk adoption on that side too, to be able to accelerate these. It doesn't mean that we're absolved in any way of doing our due diligence before we try to bring something to market, but I think, again, there's that balance.
This is very inspiring stuff, thank you. And kind of coming back to the idea of the Scrum and, you know, the distributed decision-making and the alignment of the direction, all of those very good things, but there seems to be a unique stress on that model now, which is the information sharing to give people the ability to make the decision when the information, the veracity of information today is under such stress. What do we do about that?
My first thought is to put all the politicians on a ship directed somewhere. But there has to be truth. I think one of the things I quoted to you today from Musashi is that in all these sorts of pursuits, it's founded on being able to perceive truth that you may not see. And there is a truth, you know, and sometimes the truth is an absence of data, but there's truth in transparent communication of this. You know, one of the things that's happened, as you've seen, I'm sure, in the pandemic is we don't know who to trust anymore. And we're not so much given the information, we're told what to think. And that's a cultural shift that I think we should push back against. It's okay to tell us you don't know. Tell us what you do have. Let us be part of the decision process. And I think there's an integrity and honesty that it has to start with there. And we have to hold our representatives in various forms to that.
Well, Well, with that, let's thank Dr. Cooper again. And again, we're so fortunate to have him at 3M and part of the medical ecosystem in Minnesota. And with that, we'd like to give you the conference award. Do it without breaking. Get a picture here with everybody. Just go that way, maybe. Yep, sorry. All right. Thank you, man. So a few more announcements. I'll finish up here. That was very inspirational. You know, and we have another great keynote tomorrow with Jeff Martha, the chairman and CEO. So the keynotes, and then Thursday we have the whole conference with more keynotes. So, you know, a lot to see and do. We have a clinical case presentation this afternoon, 2 tomorrow. We have the cardiac keynotes with Billy Cohn and Todd Britton here. So just a great lot of wonderful things left on the program. And again, but really enjoy being face-to-face and networking. It's been a long time, so let's take some time and just do that before we go to our 2 o'clock session. Thank you.